The Caucasians are distinguished by the facility with which it attains the highest intellectual endowment. Native Americans are averse to cultivation and slow in acquiring knowledge, restless and revengeful and fond of war, and wholly destitute of maritime adventure. Africans are joyous and flexible. That horrific and racist excerpt wasn't from some KKK member. That was one of the leading scientists of the 19th century. His name was Samuel George Morton, and he believes in some kind of division of races among the human race, and he also believed in European supremacy. And in order to prove these beliefs, he was very adamant about it. He collected skulls of what he considered different racial groups, and he tried to prove that the Europeans had a higher cranial capacity. To do this, he put custard seeds inside of the skulls, and he tried to put them inside a container and then measure the volume. And of course, it was later proved that he was very biased in his collection of the data, and he had a lot of subconscious bias, and he tried to present European skulls as having larger capacity for brains. Of course, it was all nonsense, and now it's been proven, and I'll talk about that later, how this was completely pseudoscience. Anyway, later, to prove his ridiculous claims about the size of the cranium, he used lead pellets, which he thought were more accurate, which they were, than the custard seeds. And the differences between these so-called racial groups in terms of cranial size drastically decreased after he used more accurate resources, like the lead pellets. But he was still convinced that the European race had slight advantages over others, and that this cranial size led to increased intelligence. Well, first of all, even if there was a correlation between between certain ethnic groups and having cranial sizes larger, that doesn't necessarily mean intelligence. Okay, I mean, if brain sizes determined intelligence, then dolphins and whales would be easily winning Nobel prizes because they have brains 5 times the size of humans. And while Morton and his pseudoscientific friends were still publishing these ridiculous claims about skull sizes and race, the biggest breakthrough in biology was about to happen. Charles Darwin in 1859 published his Origin of Species, and that inevitably started speculation about race. It's true that everything comes from common ancestors, and it's true that organisms adapt to their environment, and that they evolve and they speciate and they diverge, right? But immediately, pseudoscientists and racists tried to spin this for their narrative. They tried to say that Europeans maybe evolved higher levels of intelligence, and there was a lot of biological determinism going on, saying that people of maybe certain climates have lower IQ levels, and they have lower intelligence because they have lower brain capacity. And there was a lot of these ideas then. And you can clearly see how it slowly evolved from the earlier like Dark Ages level of thinking to the modern Darwinian eugenicist type level. And in fact, eugenics was actually pioneered by one of Charles Darwin's half cousins, unfortunately. And eugenics misused science to justify horrific atrocities worldwide. They're far too gruesome for me to even name here, but millions of people died in these. There were mass sterilizations that happened across the globe because of what people thought science was advocating for. And this level of racist pseudoscience was even moderately well accepted into the later part of the 20th century. It was only a little over half a century ago that in 1972, Morton, in his landmark paper, showed that there are more variations within these so-called racial groups, like, for example, the Asians, or the Africans, or the Europeans, or the Native Americans, and all these fake racial groups that Morton and his other pseudoscientific friends had pioneered for almost a century now. And there are actually far less variations between these groups. So between these racial groups, there are far less variations than there are within them, and that alone proves that much of this race science nonsense is just a social construct. And for example, any singular, say, like Sinhalese person or like a Southern Oriental person may have different genetic variations, and they may have different attributes, but they are more likely to have less in common from a purely genetic perspective than members of their own people than of another people. So that alone proves that there is no biological and genetic basis for race. And a lot of these early scholars tried to present Africans as some kind of huge homogeneous race. But Africa is the most diverse continent on Earth. I mean, it's the common ancestor of all other human civilizations as well. So from a purely genetic perspective, it's absolutely absurd that there is some kind of black race and there is some kind of white race, or brown race, or Native American race. And now it slowly starts to become accepted as science and anthropology became more evidence-based, and we value the scientific process, and we don't just push politics and racist claims anymore. And we have to start to understand that we have to put this behind us. Skin color is literally just an adaptation of UV rays to prevent harmful mutations. That's literally all that skin color is. We don't have to fight wars over this. There's no need to make racial boundaries over this. And the people who do that should rightfully be called pseudoscientists. And it's very sad to sometimes see the revival of these 19th century early European scientific practices start to pop up again, and for people to try to pretend like it's science when it's actually just racism. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Stay tuned for the next video, and I'll get you next time on Friday.